Throughout the centuries, interpretations of the Hercules myth directly reflected ancient Greek societal values and expectations of male and female archetypal roles, as well as provided philosophical insights into their respective eras. In the theater, the rigid expectations are unspoken, yet deliberate vehicles for moralizing male and female virtue in general, and specifically the virtues of Deianira. Numerous studies examine the varying interpretations of this myth. Few, if any, address the ways female Greek virtues are depicted operatically within the confines of the myth. In the music of George Frederick Handel's Hercules, Deianira contradicts the ideal Greek woman. Brief overviews of ancient Greek societal expectations and the constraints of 18th century opera seria in England, and an examination of Handel's music highlights the presence and absence of female Greek virtue. Hercules illustrates how Handel molded the Hercules myth to adhere to audience expectations and transformed the myth to appeal to the contemporary religious and societal expectations of 18th century England. Myth, as communicated through ancient Greek literature and drama, attempts to influence behavior by examining cultural imperfection and undesired human behaviors and their consequences, and thus inspires people to remain within the social mores of the culture. In ancient dramas, playwrights sought to have their dramas enrich the city-state by serving as a moral compass with which to assess oneself in order to better oneself. This was often achieved by scrutinizing heroic male and female virtues and juxtaposing them against each other. According to Plato, quote, "Human well-being was the highest aim of moral conduct and thought. The virtues were the requisite skills and character traits for Greeks in their society." End quote. For the focus of this study, virtue in the ancient world, or the Greek arete, meaning excellence or manliness in Homer's stories, is an established disposition to act in a certain way under challenging conditions. In antiquity, and therefore in this analysis, courage, self-control, and justice were the principal traits of virtue. Ancient Greek expectations for male and female were unyielding, since the roles were considered to fulfill the advancement of the Greek city-state and society as a whole. A woman's place or sphere of existence was the oikos, or the household. A woman's life and value were based on marriage, family, children, and industry in the home. Her fulfillment of her duty to the oikos was a direct reflection of her morality. A woman's expected virtues were love, obedience, seclusion, duty to the home, empathy, ability to create harmony and cooperation, and especially submission. Women were also generally considered to be emotional creatures, while men were unemotional. A man's expected virtues were honor, strategic advice, intellect, and cleverness, domination of victory over enemies, self-mastery, and worldly associations with other men to gain protection and advancement. His spheres of existence was in the polis, outside the home, and his duty was to protect the oikos. According to Shaw, a man's, quote, success is measured by the honor the community gives him. Honor is the highest goal. For a woman to exhibit male traits in any way destroyed the fabric of ancient Greek society. By dramatizing the conflict between the oikos and polis, the dramatist and later opera composer and librettist show the imperfection of humanity, the need for harmony between the sexes, and the deficiency and limits of society. In literature, the use of contrasting characters was frequently used to depict societal roles and virtues. Two distinct character models were presented in stories, the good model and the bad model. A clear demarcation between the two was easily illustrated through the presence and absence of virtues. Although this method was not absolute for all myth, it was widely used. Such is the case in Handel's Hercules, where Iole is the good model of behavior and Deianira is the bad model. Prominent character traits for Iole are submissiveness and humility. Throughout the opera, she is described as lovely, captive beauty, and blessed maid like fair Diana, and possessing a pious mind. In contrast, Deianira is described as being unjust, mistaken, cruel, and treacherous, and a guilty ghost. Deianira exhibits jealous, reproachful, and dominant behavior in her scene with Hercules, where she accuses him of infidelity. She blasts him in an uncontrolled emotional tirade where she taunts him, saying, quote, "How fallen from what you were, your fame eclipsed and all your laurels blasted. Shame to manhood. O disgrace of arms," end quote. Further, her biting text displays a lack of humility and submissiveness in the aria "Resign thy club and lion spoils," in her attempt to disgrace Hercules. In order to solidify the juxtaposition between the various characters, the virtuous Iole and the unjust Deianira in Hercules, Iole counsels Deianira on appropriate behavior. First, she tells Deianira that Hercules, or Alcides, infidelity is the blackest falsehood and a forged tale. Then, in the aria "Think What Ills," Iole warns Deianira to beware of jealousy and to strive for harmony. The virtue of creating harmony and cooperation in the home is an Athenian female virtue, and it is Iole, possessor of the virtue, who counsels the virtueless Deianira on how to behave. In Handel's Hercules, Deianira was in rebellion against the norms of her society, as well as the female societal norms of 18th century England. Expected 18th century roles and virtues for women did not differ much from those of antiquity, and therefore were acceptable depictions of women for the Handelian audience. In 18th century England, the woman was a shadow of her husband. Female education and conduct emphasized the virtues of humility and patience. It was taught that women should, quote, "give up their opinions and not pertinaciously to carry on a dispute, even if they would know themselves to be right," end quote. Therefore, Deianira's open criticism of Hercules would have been viewed as despicable by both audiences. Men, on the other hand, like Handel's Hercules, were not under such restraint. Hercules' character in the oratorio was described as a godlike, valiant chief. He was a gallant and merciful conqueror, faithful husband, generous victor, and god of battle, a, quote, "hero with laurel crowned," end quote. When Deianira claimed that Alcides cheated on him, Lycus exclaimed, quote, "Alcides false? Impossible," end quote. Hercules was the mighty warrior whom not Juno's hate nor a long series of incessant labors could e'er subdue. In addition to his many qualities, Hercules' love for Deianira was described as, quote, "ever faithful love and constancy," end quote. He was depicted as the ideal man, faithful to one woman. In contrast, he was rather promiscuous in ancient myths, having slept with 50 virgins in one night, being but one example. Further, in antiquity, according to the regulation of stuprum, or criminal fornication, men could commit adultery with any other unmarried woman or widow who was not an upper-class woman. Because Iole was a captured princess and thus reduced to the state of slave, he was well within his legal rights to sleep with her and have children. Likewise, concerning infidelity in 18th century English courts, a husband's adultery was not grounds for divorce. Rather, the woman was considered to be at fault if her husband committed adultery. According to historian Kirsten Olsen, infidelity was a common practice in 18th century England where, quote, "plenty of prominent men openly slept with mistresses and supported whole families of illegitimate children," end quote. Even though in antiquity and 18th century cultures, Hercules could have committed adultery without repercussions, he is depicted in a purified form, not having strayed from Deianira in Handel's Hercules. This was perhaps to show the heroic male in contrast to the sullied female Deianira, thus placing his godlike male status above all others. In oratorio, Hercules is treated with reverence by all characters, except Deianira, and his questionable actions are justified in the libretto. When Hercules does something that would be considered under 18th century mores as socially unacceptable, text is added to justify the behavior. For instance, when Deianira discusses Hercules' destruction of Oechalia, Iole defends Hercules, claiming, quote, "it was ambition, not slighted love, that laid Oechalia low," end quote. Thus attributing Hercules with yet another virtue, this time the 18th century virtue of ambition, which was respectable in merchant-driven London. The overwhelming evidence in the libretto of the virtuous nature of Hercules and Iole is unmistakable. Thus, Broughton used the method of contrasting characters to comment on virtue and gender roles, and Broughton's engineered disparity between Deianira and the virtuous nature of Hercules and Iole is clearly delineated. Analysis of gender roles and virtues, as depicted in opera, yields historical perspectives of the culture for which the myths were composed. Composers and librettists altered various elements of myth, including text, plot, and characters, in order to support the society's accepted belief system and religion. Religion and social constructs were the primary factors in driving these alterations. Not wanting to offend lucrative patrons, it also was in Handel's best interest to adapt librettos to appeal to his audience taste. For instance, in Hercules, Handel chose to use allegorical characters of liberty, jealousy, and hope as figures to pray to instead of the gods. The reason for this was twofold. First, allegorical characters were present in most masques, which were fashionable in the early 18th century, and acceptable, unrealistic deities. Thus, the substitution of allegorical characters would have been pleasing to the English audience. Second, allegorical characters gave an opportunity to detract from the more questionable heathenistic religious practices of the Greeks praying to the gods. The only women's prayer to the gods in Hercules is at the end of the opera when Deianira cries out to Jove, quote, "Father of Hercules, great Jove, oh help this last expedient of despairing love," end quote. It seems to be acceptable in this instance because at this point in the opera, Deianira has already been stripped of any virtue. The heathen act of praying to the gods only anchors her lack of virtue in the eyes of the 18th century audience. Because of the sensitivity of the 18th century audiences, Christian audiences, to heathen beliefs, especially considering England's tragic history with religious conflict, the literal portrayal of mythical creatures like the Erinyes or Furies was offensive. Thus, in Hercules, the word choice in Deianira's aria, "Where shall I fly?" was edited to reflect this belief. Reverend Thomas Broughton, the English librettist of Hercules, and Handel initially opted to paint the Erinyes as real beings or characters in the recitative to keep the authenticity of the myth. But when they swooped down on Deianira in the aria, they added the words, quote, "Furies of the mind," end quote, to show that the Furies were merely in her mind. She was not literally being pursued by vengeful goddesses. The portrayal of Deianira's dementia here compounds her lack of virtue in the oratorio. Another example of alteration to appease audiences was Handel's plot change to replace Deianira's suicide with a mad scene. Contrary to Christian beliefs, suicide was a magnanimous act in antiquity, because the early Greeks considered suicide an appropriate solution to many stressful situations, such as dishonor or disappointment in love. Although, in 18th century, suicide was no longer thought to be the work of the devil or sin, rather the product of a deranged mind, there was still grave trepidation about the subject of suicide. According to historian Kristen Olsen, quote, "Suicide was common and feared to be on the increase, especially after some high-profile cases," end quote, and therefore a distasteful subject for the theater. Conversely, mental illness, madness, and emotional outbursts were fascinating to the people in the 18th century. London's Bethlehem Hospital, or Bedlam, was open to the public at that time and was one of London's principal tourist attractions until 1770. Therefore, Handel took all these things under consideration and removed Deianira's suicide from the work and replaced it with the mad scene to pique his audience's interests. The mad scene was ultimately more engaging to his audience and made Deianira more enthralling and unvirtuous. Handel's English oratorio Hercules premiered in January 1745 in the King's Theatre in London. Oratorios were basically unstage operas performed in concert format without sets, blocking, and costumes. For the libretto, Broughton adapted the Hercules myth from Ovid's Metamorphoses, Seneca's Hercules Aeneas, and Sophocles' Trachine. The three different sources Broughton chose depict three altogether different Deianiras. Broughton took aspects of each work and conformed them to 18th century norms to invent Deianira of Handel's Hercules. The first Deianira is from Sophocles' Trachinae, where Hercules' adultery is certain. In this story, Deianira is slow to believe the rumor, and she is level-headed in her reaction to the rumors, saying, "I would be altogether mad to blame my husband or that woman. She has been guilty of nothing shameful, and she has done no harm to me." End quote. Here, her main grievance is that she must share a household with Iole and fears that Hercules' love is dwindling. When she commits suicide, it is because of Hercules' death by her hand, as well as Hylas' belief that she would deliberately murder Hercules. In Trachinae, Deianira is somewhat honorable and virtuous and is completely sane through the story. Broughton kept Deianira's proclamation of Iole's innocence in the matter. The next Deianira is from Seneca's Hercules Aeneas, where again Hercules' adultery is certain. Here, she is furious with her husband's infidelity and concerned about offspring from the union of Hercules and Iole. As a result, she maliciously plots vengeance in Hercules' murder. Here, Deianira commits suicide only after seeing the grotesque aftermath of the burning robe, which plummets her into a guilty madness. Broughton infused Handel's work with her furious reaction to infidelity and madness from Hercules' grotesque death. Finally, the last Deianira depicted from Book 9 of Ovid's Metamorphoses, where Hercules' infidelity is unsubstantiated and is merely a rumor. Deianira, in turn, believes he is unfaithful, but wavers on a course of action. She thinks it best to send Nessus' robe to amend relations, quote, as she is not aware that what she sends can only bring her ruin and lament, end quote. There's no mention of Deianira's fate after this line. Broughton chose to keep Hercules' innocence and Deianira's inability to make a decision on the matter. The depiction of Deianira in Handel's Hercules shows her to be a woman of intelligent means, suffering melancholy at the beginning of the opera, which progresses to a state of severe depression and ultimately climaxes with a dramatic mental breakdown and an explosive display of emotion, or what in the 18th century would be called a hysteric paroxysm or fit. It is important to note the striking similarity between the depiction of Handel's Deianira and Handelian audience beliefs about hysteria. In the early 18th century England, there were numerous writings about the condition of hysteria, and was a well-known common ailment affecting women. According to the most prominent British physicians of the time, Thomas Sydenham, hysteria was the commonest of all chronic diseases. Although no concrete evidence can show that Handel or Broughton studied these writings, it is logical to deduce that they were aware of the condition, just as in contemporary society, we are aware of complaints and symptoms of influenza or the common cold. According to musicologist David Ross Hurley, quote, the symptoms of hysteria described in 18th century medical writings could account not only for the original elements of Broughton's libretto, its main dramatic motive and its structure, but also for certain unconventional features of Handel's musical setting, end quote. Deianira's erratic behavior in Broughton's libretto depicts her inability to remain constant in any one emotional state, which is another symptom of hysteria. This choice lends to the argument that Broughton inferred that Deianira suffered from the well-known condition of hysteria. She claimed that, quote, fame speaks aloud her wrongs, love, jealousy, and rage at once distract her, end quote. Her music also reflects these rapid shifts in mental state and is displayed in the uncharacteristic contrasts in aria styles. The aria, there in Myrtle Shades Reclined, is slow and eloquent, with a refined lyrical line, which is followed by the aria Begone My Fears, Fly Hence Away, which has rapid-fire coloratura depicting an almost frantic, joyful outburst. Although it was typical for singers in the area to have different types of arias with different tempi, the frantic nature of this aria is quite unlike the rest of her arias and is shocking compared to the more subdued music that came before it. Her constant inconstancy and unpredictable mood shifts illustrates Deianira's degradation of character. Because Handel was predominantly a composer of Italian opera in England, His compositions, including Hercules, conformed to the form and style of opera seria. Opera serias were based on numerous prescribed inventions, some of which were: the arias were usually da capo or ABA. The arias had a unity of effect or emotion, conveying one motion for each section of the aria. The action of the plot happened during the recitatives, not the arias. The libretto was based on formulaic entrances and exits of singers. According to Handel expert Winton Dean, quote, "The chief objective of 18th century opera was to express feelings in music," end quote. There was a necessity for a clear distinction between recitative and aria. Recitative was where the action took place in real time. The aria was a lyrical freeze frame to express emotion. Arias helped the audience understand what the character was thinking and feeling, but did not develop the plot per se. The da capo form came to dictate opera seria in approximately 1690, and so Handel was taking up a practice already well established. The basic format for an opera seria as a whole was the basic cycle of recitative into aria into recitative into aria. Handel adopted this formula when he began writing Hercules. However, he chose to create arias that ventured away from the traditional formula of recitative. Aria, recitative. The characters and situations in which he purposely diverged from the norm are how he musically depicted the emotional and virtuous nature of the characters. For instance, on the aria chart in your handout, you will notice that Deianira's character is rarely followed the normal ABA da capo form. Aioli and Hercules arias usually adhere to opera seria conventions. One can thus infer that virtue and adherence to social norms is depicted with convention, and lack of virtue and rebellion to social norms is depicted with untraditional compositional techniques. Deianira's aria Where Shall I Fly deviates from the da capo form, is fraught with variation, breaks with traditional conventions, and is unique and revolutionary in its substance. It is a melding of several different Baroque forms: ritornello, binary, rondo, and even ternary form if you were to include the recitative as the A section of the piece. Further, Handel alludes to a through-composed style, with motivic elements providing a foundation. In addition, rather than having a distinct separation between recit and aria, Handel allies them together. He also includes more musical allusions, thinking sections together instead of using strong cadences to separate them. Handel's use of key structure and harmony is also radical. Most arias follow simple principles from tonic to dominant key relations, usually progressing to one key and then returning to the original key. However, in this piece, the recitative has a uniquely open tonal form that goes through several different keys. Further, the aria goes through many different keys to create an unstable dramatic environment, depicting Deianira's unruly mind and emotional state. Handel also supports her character with word painting. For instance, on the words fatal error, the harmony is harsh and dissonant. Chromatic leaps and dissonant notes appear to underscore Deianira's cries, "What yellings rend my tortured ear," to create a jarring effect. Deianira's hysteria is depicted musically in the structure of her mad scene. Likewise, she shifts between lamentation and frantic emotional outbursts. The typical unity is not present. Abrupt changes of harmony, mood, meter, and accompaniment add to the drama and display her mental state. Handel subverts traditional music structure to depict her lack of virtue, madness, and hysteria. Let's listen and watch a little bit at the beginning to get a better understanding. So that should give you a little bit of a taste of the erratic nature of the music, especially considering the conventions of opera seria. In conclusion, virtues are nearly impossible to delineate in the theater without showing them displayed by contrasting characters. Deianira's shattered virtue is displayed in contrast to the wholesome Iole and heroic Hercules. Just as Deianira rebels against the expected female norms and virtues of society, Handel's music does not follow the expected rules of form, structure, or harmony when marrying music to her character. Therefore, Handel reflects the unvirtuous, aberrant nature of Deianira's character in an atypical musical form, to depict her inconstant nature and to express the myth in a way that would appeal to the English audience. Greek myths are inextricably woven into the fabric of Western culture. The heroism of the spirit in conflict and tragedy draws us back to the Greek dramas. The characters are honest, merciless, and absolute, and they behave in the most noble and truthful manner when struck down by the calamities of life. No matter what our divergent cultural beliefs may be, the universal characters of tragedy are an inspiration for understanding the human condition and emerging self-awareness. Aristotle said, quote, "Tragedy generates pity and fear to bring out the catharsis of these emotions," end quote. This catharsis allows audiences to vicariously face some of the worst events and emotions in life, offers some form of resolution, and provides opportunity for understanding and compassion. Music is the vehicle to depict the drama and offer resolution and understanding in ways that mere words cannot. The last words of Deianira and Hercules are, quote, "Words are too faint to speak the warring passions that combat in my breast. Grief, wonder, joy by turns deject and elevate my soul." And so does Handel's music and Brahms' libretto. Thank you so much for your attention. I welcome feedback and questions, so please do not hesitate to contact me. Thank you and have a wonderful conference.